model, we construct a call to MSO, and we make a call to MSO. And that performs the scale up of that. And that's two very simple use cases that we have so far. And so I would think the current use case or the proposed use cases that we have currently are for at least one that's a very similar type of flow. Now, to implement that in policy, we have two types of policies that we use. We use configuration policies, in which we configure the DCAE microservices and collectors. Basically, hey, what are the thresholds that we need to look at or determine in order to determine an event? That's what we've been calling those as configuration policies. Whereas the actual event that goes to policy, the control loop event, that's going to be driven by what we call an operational type of policy. So here's an event that happens, so now operations comes in and they want to run a specific set of actions based on that event. So we kind of right now we currently classify our policies like that. And yes,
what are the negatives? Something doesn't go right and you control it. Is there like any predisposed event calling for ticketing?
Yeah, I mean, the architecture that we built, when we're publishing messages on DMAP, and so the world knows what's going on, an event happens at DCAE. When it gets into policy, we actually publish out on our own DMAP topic what we're doing for this event. And so we'll say, hey, we received it, we're actively processing it, we're performing this operation was successful or it failed in the case that you're talking about, Trump. If it fails, then when people write the policy, they can specify, well, where do I want to go when it fails? Maybe I want to go and do a health check. Maybe I want to, instead of restarting a VM, maybe I want to rebuild it, or maybe I want to migrate it. So we have a nice architecture that eventually we will go to an exit point on that. If all else fails, we can't, we restarted this 5 times, we tried to rebuild it, there's still a problem. We have a final notification that goes out on the message bus that says we failed in this action. At that point, there should be, and what we have internally is we have an operations team listening to those events, and at that point, they will generate a ticket for somebody to manually go in and see what's going on.
But in one of the previous sessions, I did bring up this notion of there needs to be some sort of an interface for ticketing or interfacing to external OSS, DSS systems. Right now, there is no such interface with the ONAPF. Right? There's one that absolutely we can invoke that as a last resort, saying, we tried everything that we've been, all the rules that have been configured, none of them seems to have succeeded as a last resort to sending this ticketing request or whatever.
But it may not be a bad idea to create even tickets for everything that you're doing so that people are aware of what is happening.
Well, that just inundates operations with tickets, and it's hard for them to distinguish between what's something they need to act on versus information, right? And they now have hundreds of tickets that they're getting.
Yeah, but they can mark it, I think.
It may overwhelm them. There's a lot of information that's set up.
Yeah, but again, see, the way I was thinking was, if you were to look at some intelligent, and there was some discussion in the earlier session about machine learning, AI, and all that, right? So having that database of information that these calls are coming in and what you did with them. And again, people don't have to see it unless it's marked as intervention from a technician required. So that, I'm just thinking from that perspective, having that database of everything that has happened with the tickets and from operations point of view, and running some later on.
I would split that into two things. One, I agree with your point that we need to have information about what is happening. That's certainly valid. I don't think ticketing is the way to do that necessarily. Yeah. You need to store that information, right? Now, what was my second stream? It comes back.
So yeah, let me ask one quick question more. So what I'm hearing from you, depending on what we event, whether fault or we get the measurement, you can build some policies, right? Is there a third category of policies that you also look at? For example, because of some storm that has hit some place, and suddenly I start seeing the tickets, I can filter them out or something. So is that a policy or is it something different? Can operational activate something?
Well, I guess what you're doing, what you're suggesting is we're looking at the health of the network, and we're finding here's a spot in the network where we see a lot of problems going on. could we have a policy out there that gets triggered or
And
can
filters
help?
out the EC.
Yeah, yeah. I mean, I think
That
we
is
can-
another category.
So,
hold on, let me try to be fair and make sure everybody can say, can do something. Go ahead, Marshall.
Yeah, so it's just part of plans, that's figuring,
No.
that is not part of the runtime platform. It just has keep things up and running.
yeah, okay, I mean, part of it, of creating template that will filter what kind of alarm, because you know that, is due to, some door somewhere, and,
I'm not sure that you could predict that. For those that don't know, CLAMP is a tool where we actually construct a closed loop. It's more of a design time type of situation where we go, here's our control loop. These are our DCAE microservices, our controllers, our collectors, and here's the policies associated with it. And eventually, once services get instantiated, that it goes through this process of a blueprint gets deployed. And I'm just being very brief on it because I want to make sure we stick to what we need to be doing here today. But what you folks are describing here about, like, okay, now we've got a network that, or part of our network isn't behaving very well. My opinion is that could be some sort of a separate type of policy that's set up maybe before we even think about services. Hey, here's some policies that we need to create and enable in order to help protect the network, regardless of what services are on.
So then it's good for this release.
I don't know. Should it be? Here, let's put it down.
Well, then it's good.
Do we need policies to help me out?
Do we need orchestration policies, what I would call it? Well, orchestration of what?
infrastructure.
Well,
Infrastructure.
maybe.
But again, of what?
Replacement policy.
So placement.
That's different, yes.
So placement policy.
So-
Most of the use cases demand it. But it's also, yeah, I'm not sure if that's echo or not, but.
No, sorry, I was trying to jump in. This is Brian. I did put a comment in the chat. I am requesting that we set up an Etherpad or something so that we can have collaborative input into the meeting remotely as well. I suggest that we start by classifying the policy types, along the notions of purpose, et cetera, that are currently supported in DCAE. And that we will have in scope for the first release. I assume that DCAE is the framework that we are talking about here, and that anything coming from OpenO is only related to the legacy VF controller that they have. But the types, for example, I would suggest be along the lines of scaling, placement, security, fault response, telemetry, et cetera. We need to start at high level purpose of the policy breakdown so we can identify what is currently supported and what we're going to have in the first release.
Brian, I didn't understand your comment about DCAE here. Which policy framework is going to be used going forward? In OpenO, we had a homegrown policy engine.
Yeah, I believe architecturally.
Here to argue technologies. We're
I think Brian was basically assuming that it would be the
DCAE, I believe, will be the basis for the closed loop policy management framework for ONAP. If anybody else has a different understanding, please voice it.
Yeah, DCAE is all about data collection and analytics, and that's it. That's its only job. And yes, it's policy driven, but
you typically end up with policy enforcement being done outside of the analytics engines.
There's policy enforcement definitely within DCAE because, for example, you have collectors, and you want if you're an operations person, you may want to be able to control them. What are my thresholds? Do I want to pull them up, pull them down? Do I want to match on different things, and et cetera, as things are going along runtime? So there is some policy that draws part of that, but as well as on the policy platform side of things, that's where we definitely need policy.
Well, I think his point is correct, right? If we know what are the different types of policies that you can work with, then we can decide which policies are part of release 1 and which would be coming up later on.
But it also, so it also depends a little bit on other things as well. So, for example, placement policies. Unless there is something, I'm not sure, maybe there is. Unless there's a way of grouping or tagging resources or pooling them, and or somehow differentiating between different kinds of resources. Placement could be,
What do you mean by that?
I want to be able to place a VNF component on a VM running on a server with a chipset feature X, because I'm accelerating the crap out of my VNF, right?
Also, you're using.
Yes, right?
So I think there's multiple types of placement policies. Right? Think of placement policy like this said, which is within the infrastructure, what type of capabilities are needed. There's also placement policies around things like, latencies and so on. So let's say you're constructing a chain of DNS. What is the latency that you can tolerate between the different VMs or the different DNS that are part of the chain? If you have a customer that terminates in a particular DNS, what's the latency between the customer endpoint and the DNS that you're willing to tolerate? So those are also factors that goes into, those are also policies, right? I mean, there are two different kinds of placement policies, but they are placement policies.
In that list I provided, SLA policies would certainly be one area, one type that could be derived into other functional type policies to fulfill the SLA. But yes, that would be part of the VNF package, et cetera, and somehow have to be considered.
In some sense, if the service templates or whatever we call them is a way of expressing intent, there's some counter policies that would limit or throttle exactly what you're asking for. So we ought to.
The question in the back.
If we look at the use cases, it's not one of the big issues that these use cases they're sort of an order of magnitude more complicated than what was there before. So it's not one of the new problems. There's the risk of more conflicting policies. Because it's not going to be that, like say even the one use case was like EPC and IMS. So we're going to have policies for IMS, we're going to have policies for EPC that are going to be independent of each other, but they can be starting to conflict with each other. One will be saying scale down, the other will be saying scale up. And at the same time, and then so we have to start to deal with this. We're looking for what is introduced by the use case. Equally with the placement, both the use cases are defining I need to be able to deploy functionality in two different locations. So now it's not that I just have to be able to monitor the capacity in one place. I have to be able to monitor capacity in another place. And I can have a policy which states switch over when I see a fault. But then that can be conflicting. Now suddenly the other side is seeing no traffic and goes, oh, I can scale down. And then you can get started.
And do we want policy decisions, for example, to trigger orchestration actions?
Oh, they have to be, absolutely.
Yeah, that would be a control loop. You could define it, right?
Orchestration. Yeah.
No, right, but as part of a control loop, the condition was. Yeah, sorry. Control loop, and so you detect it in the policy. You need a policy that will talk.
So in fact, I think one of the
I'm sorry. Yeah, I am trying to write fast and trying to translate everything into the table.
So in fact, I think one of the ONAPF demos, existing demos, does talk to the service orchestrator.
Yes, the VDNF.
So that's also where some of these infrastructure policies would come in, right? Because to scale something out, you would still now you have some complications. You can't just take the next.
Right. And this is where we actually don't have MSO. We really haven't policy enabled the orchestrator, because it just takes a request and does what it doesn't go back to the policy engine and say, hey, I've been told to do this, irregardless who told me to do it, it's policy or somebody else. I'm now attempting to perform this action on the network, and what are the policies that help drive that? That hasn't been that working out.
Okay. So if I'm not sure if there are any optimized DNFs in the first release, but if there are, then we would probably want to close the loop in a different, no pun intended, in a different way, right? Start with the placement, then go on to, and monitoring obviously is something that we can do, also bring a lot of information up from the infrastructure, and then remediation as well. Because if
if you use the particular, and then affinity and anti-affinity is another thing.
Today, placement, the placement doesn't go to policy.
So
I understood that placement optimization would be a kind of separate module or feature in ONAPF. And I don't get the connection with policy.
So the
The
constraints,
differentiation issue, not runtime.
no, so it's really the constraints that drive the placement optimization policy, right? I mean, the constraints that drive the placement optimization of policy.
Yeah, but this is a differentiation.
So let me,
how about you
let
guys
me
in front?
explain.
You guys in front, you gotta raise your hand, because everybody's back is raising their hand. So I think this gentleman next.
So do we already have a policy definition language, or do we need to select timeline?
That's
Yeah, the way it works now is we're model driven, so we utilize models that come into our engine platform, and the models drive the templates, and that's how we define.
Yeah, but there has to be kind of some meta model for the policy definition.
Right, yes, and then we have two different policy languages that we utilize for
So
that.
there are,
Yeah.
okay.
Yeah, and now we will be bringing into the master branch an actual policy language itself. It's a YAML-based language, and it's for defining operational type of policies. And the reason we're bringing that in is we want to keep it simple. We want operators to be able to come in and say, based on this condition, this event, this control loop event, I want to do this action. Based on this, I want to go. Based on the results of that, I want to go do this, go do that. And so we'll be introducing a very simple policy relation. Let me get the lady in the back. She's been waiting.
Okay, somebody has mentioned runtime policy replacement, 5G specs for splicing, support movement, tear down movement of slices too. So especially if users are mobile.
Yeah, so the way, at least the way we've been thinking about it, and I'm not saying that's how we should implement it, the way we've been thinking about it is it's a combination of placement optimization, it's a combination and the policies that drive that placement optimization and actual orchestration, right? So if you sort of combine the orchestrator doing this placement optimization every time it needs to spin up or move this instance from one location to the other, it will invoke this optimization and say, okay, what is the appropriate location for that new instance, which is driven by the place policies that constrain what are the places in which you can officially.
And it's still runtime policy, right?
No, yeah, so you're doing this optimization at runtime, so in that sense, the policy is used at runtime. But that's how we've been thinking about it. It's not out in ONAPF.
Yeah,
What needs to happen?
I think we need to have.
Hey, Brian, you and I are conflicting here because we're both editing at the same time.
The edits will be merged, don't worry.
Well, no, it's conflicting, so it's not merging, but I'm just gonna let you edit it, okay?
No, it's okay. I'll drop out. Go ahead.
No, it's okay, Brian. It doesn't matter if it's you or me to edit. One of us just has to edit, and I think you might be better to capture that while I mediate here. So I'm gonna go next. I don't know who's the next.
My name's
Andy.
So I'm kind of interested in policy creation. So I'm guessing that a lot of policies are manually created and have to jump through. Can we also look at opportunities for giving guidance to VNF vendors for creating policies as part of the VNF package so they can be adjusted automatically?
Yeah, that's definitely, I know, I can speak for us, that we definitely want to go along and figure out when is it best to collect the information for policy? Where can people express it? Especially during the design phase, when they're onboarding VNF and when they're, defining services.
But if we define it in a kind of standardized way, we can onboard the VNF with.
Yeah, with that
with the
information.
policies, right.
So you will see an example of Friday we'll talk about, when we talk about VS, we'll talk about exactly what you just talked about. There's an onboarding YAML artifact which will derive the actions to take and what to do with them. Exactly. So that starts from a vendor. Perfect, thank you. So if you're there, it is it's part of a discussion that is happening Friday on a service assurance.
But we should consider that as, we should consider that input as potentially being part of the VNF package.
I agree with you. That we can add there. But I said if you wanted to see some of the recommendations that are coming out and you'll have input to that, that would be a learn about it.
So just to clarify what I meant by the placement stuff, this is an example out of a commercial system that can deploy VNFs, where you can create a pool of resources that have, and you can tag resources based on features that they have, different kinds of features, whether they're chip level or something else, doesn't matter. And what the policy basically says is that when somebody wants to provision a service offering instance X, we use resources from pool Y. And that basically guarantees that you're going to get the right hardware to instantiate things on. Something along those lines would be useful, and that would also address the 5G, right sizing and reconfiguration at runtime.
Just a quick question on what you're saying. Wouldn't it be part of instantiation package which says what kind of environment you need to set up your VNF or whatever it is?
So there's the top-down specification of what I need, my intent. Then there's something that needs to be resolved against the actual infrastructure. So I discover my infrastructure, I discover my on-chip capabilities, my hypervisor capabilities. I need to model that somehow. No one has talked about that yet. But let's say we've modeled it somewhere in the inventory. So now there's a matchmaking process that occurs when I do the instantiation. And part of that matchmaking is be able to say, here are my requirements, here are my capabilities. I'm going to do best fit match against the capability. And if I cannot satisfy all the requirements, then I've failed my provisioning or my instantiation. That's how it would work in a well-behaved sort of world.
Yeah, actually, I agree with it. I mean, we need a placement optimization for VNFs for sure. The only thing I wanted to say that I understood that today the lead person that instantiate the VNFs just doesn't ever trigger policy. So you can put whatever system in your policy. The question is what are the impacts on the other modules, so that the instantiation takes into account
Absolutely, I agree. And if you remember today morning session, which I was participating on the end-to-end flows, during the instantiation, we made it a point to say the service orchestrator needs to branch out to a placement optimization module that will do this optimization for you, and then do the placement based on that.
in policy.
Was that?
It would not be in policy.
It would be policy enabled,
It would be policy
But
enabled.
it would have to be, yeah.
I mean, you could think of it as an optimization program that's running, right, and this response. But it can ask policy, hey, what are the policies associated with doing this sort of placement optimization?
It's a big project to launch, right?
Is that?
The placement module is a specific project to launch.
Yeah.
Trump?
Just clarify how many PDPs are we talking about here?
Well, I mean, now you're starting to get into technical detail.
Right.
I mean, currently we have two decision engines. We have a Zafamo engine, which does fine-grained authorization. It's a decision type of engine. We also are utilizing a rules engine, which is more of a stateful type of engine, and we use that for driving the control loop. I mean, I don't want to argue, what's better and what's best, and right now, what we really need to be going through is what do we need to do the use cases, and then how do we, at this point, we've spent a half hour in, we've got 15 minutes left, so I don't know if we want to start now focusing on, now that we've identified these types of needs, what kind of projects we want to build out of this.
So Pam, maybe you want to refresh the page or whatever. I've been taking notes as you suggested.
All right.
Thank you, Brian.
There you go.
It's a good thing I'm in front of the microphone.
Show it
You
better.
can hear everything I say for that.
All right.
Good placement policy right here.
Sorry?
I'm in front of the microphone. That's a good placement policy.
We have ticketing, ticketing service, do we need a service for that? I think then we have infrastructure policies, placement policies, funding policies, supporting.
Question on the infrastructure policy, right? Doesn't that depend on the APIs that are exposed by the infrastructure? I mean, we could start capturing these policies, but how do you then influence that as the infrastructure?
So presumably different VIMs have northbound adapters, right? And the VIMs themselves have the ability to choose the right capabilities, right? So
So, but that assumes that the wind and.
Yeah, most of the ones, I think, the ones that we were talking about, at least the multi-VIM project for ONAP, have that. So there's another, sorry if there was, okay. There's a bunch of, I don't know if this exists already, but what happens when things fail? So placements do not succeed sometimes. And so there are two things, right? You know, there is what to do if that occurs. That's one kind of policy, and I could have choices. Leave it alone, we'll garbage collect later, or go try to roll back, or other things. And then there's a bunch of other policies on how to undo what you've done. Right?
Sure.
Is that something that's part of the equation here, or?
Yeah, and maybe perhaps that needs to be there.
I'm just throwing that out.
I agree.
And then the other thing, since we're dealing with VMware as one of the VIMs, if you look at the VMware hypervisor, they have their own policies. And so you got to be able to inject and delegate policies as well as part of, because DRS, when enabled, will do amazing things.
It is hard to tell what is encapsulated within all these things out in the network. But I think one of our goals has been we have a policy platform and we want to keep policy in that platform. And if we start allowing things to be distributed everywhere, how would we ever know who's doing what at any point? How would we know what a policy is being
applied? So just to qualify what she said, it is, think of it as this is one central place to which policies get specified. So the enforcement will happen in all sorts of places, in the infrastructure level, in the orchestration level, in the control level, and things like that. But the specification of the policy should all come from one central location so that it goes to the consistency.
And that's going to ease your ability to do conflict detection. And be able to also then develop guard policies, state policies, maybe general overall policies. So,
yeah. All I'm saying is that there will be out-of-band policies in the VIMs.
Nothing we can do about it. I mean, MariaDB has a policy. Right?
Or OpenStack is going to have.
Congress.
So Congress has stuff to do with.
Yeah. Then there's that.
Yeah. Sure. I'll refresh again. But Brian, this one column defines policies currently supported in DCAE, and then you talk about scaling placement. I think DCAE is mainly controlled as policies.
So it's actually just policies for the analytics.
For the analytic, yeah.
Not even control.
It's not, that's true. I mean.
Well, it would be good to clarify then, from an architectural perspective, where these things fit. I mean, my history has been to understand that, DCAE is about the collection of state from the apps and eventually the NFVI, and then facilitation of particular, reactive, if you will, applications of that distributed message bus, right, that then act upon those events according to what the policies have been defined. So from an architectural perspective, it would be good to understand, what software is actually involved in that, what's supporting software such as DCAE as a framework for collection, et cetera. That's separate.
Identifying where are the enforcers?
Yeah.
Where are they currently, and where do we need them to be?
Correct.
That's what okay.
I found that the policy comes with the polydraw and the XACML.
Xacmo.
Xacmo, and you also mentioned that the young related issues. Then, is there any guideline? If I would like to scale out or something like that, which policy language I should choose? Or
well,
today you don't even know which entity.
Yeah.
You have one interface which is specifying it. The specific technology that is being used underneath is almost oblivious to that.
Yeah, we would actually just like to be able to collect policy or express policy at a very high abstraction and get that pulled into the system at all the various points through SDC and through maybe CLAMP or in various other places. Then when runtime comes along and you want to enforce that, implement it, you can choose which engine you need at that point to do that. It could be a Xacamel, it could be Drools, it could be both. Maybe it'd be something else. I don't know.
If it's about, you probably are using some kind of workflow specification for the actions of the policy.
Yeah, like I said, we have a YAML specification that we came up
And
with.
then it talks about the workflow.
Yeah, we got away from workflow.
No,
It's debatable, is it a workflow or not? But we do have a specification we'll bring out, and then we can talk more. Yeah, strong.
Is there any need of different layers of abstraction for policies, or some are higher level, some are lower level, and some kind of translation?
I mean, I would agree with you on that, but I think so. It's my opinion.
So if we're talking about levels of abstraction of policies, that means we probably need to model them.
Right. Yep. We got 6 minutes. You want to start pumping out projects here? All right. What do you guys want? It sounds like
Well, the first project is we need a policy.
we need a policy. That's a good one.
Gotta build a hammer.
Thanks, Brian. Okay.
This is how you asphyxiate yourself going up into the dizzy heights of menopause.
Let me go back up here. Distributed policy tools and framework, NFBI, VNF package.
Reflecting the conflict. That's awesome. Conflict. Policy conflict.
Conflict detection.
Conflict.
Yeah. Yeah, let's add a need on there for conflict detection. Brian,
Okay.
Thank you. That's
Can you scroll up? Just
sorry.
up.
Up, yeah, these were the early ones that I put on there.
No, I guess down. The other way.
The other up?
Ah,
Backwards up?
I don't know. I'm an Apple user.
These are the last three right here.
Okay.
So can we combine any of these into one thing, or?
So one thing we were thinking about doing is one project that would cover all of the infrastructure-centric sort of related work. But I'm not sure yet if that's going to be possible to do all at once.
Well, we could just define the project and then set the scope within it and say, well, what can we tackle through?
Yeah, it all depends on. Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, we could do that, I suppose.
Okay, so our first project is infrastructure policy.
Replacement.
Your telemetries, SLAs, things like that, scaling.
Yeah.
So infrastructure, for example, for placement purposes. Okay. Another aspect of this is, and this is, based on work we did in OPNFV early on, looking at policy over the last 2 years, is the distribution of policy into the system, okay, based upon what has come from either the VNF or service definition, right, or generic policies that apply independent of the VNF. So, in terms of software repos, which I think is, the first split where you think about a separate project, a system that makes it possible to ingest, to distribute, and to put in place policies that are either specific to a VNF or generic, that'll be a different set of software compared to the let's say the SDK aspects or the operational aspects of the policy engines.
The VNF SDK?
So are you saying here's a specific policy engine and it supports these types of policies and it's it only gets the distribution of those policies? Is that what you're saying, or?
Correct. In the VNF package, there will probably be different types of artifacts in different types of policy expressions based upon current practice in DCAE and in ONAPF2F A4. These will be distributed as part of the process of setting up, right? The VNF controller and the DCAE elements that are going to monitor the VNF. There are also generic policies that are not VNF specific that'll be established as sort of a fence around what should or shouldn't happen, right?
Yeah, that's the tricky point of that is that, if you want to distribute the policies, you have to make sure that it's accounting for every policy in there. So if somebody asks for a policy decision, it's taking all the policies into account, not just what is for my VNF. Because there could be specific policies that were put in there by operations folks for the whole network.
Correct.
Yeah.
That's what I mean. And so the software from a repo perspective that manages the if you will, the distribution and establishment of policies in a general sense will be different from the software that applies policies on a VNF basis. So it may be useful to have separate projects for those two distinct things.
Yeah, certainly there would be value in having a policy distribution project and how policies get distributed to PDP engines that are being hopefully distributed by an ONAPF controller.
And as part of that, would you have policy repo as well,
Well, I think, my opinion, our opinion is there's one central policy repository. And that's where they should all be there. We know what they are. We know what all the policies are. They're not spread out throughout the whole system. But now this is a runtime issue. Let's say in separate data centers we have different engines up and running, but they only need some certain set of policies. But we have to make sure they get all the required policies that they need so that everything is being implemented.
So we have a policy repo already?
Yes.
Okay.
Yeah, there's a policy repo.
So,
I think that is a policy repo.
Yeah, we already have a.
Well, so the first thing is that the first release, nothing's a given, right? We have to, that's sort of one of the projects we need to have. We have to say, I think the reason we're having this discussion is as part of the first release, we have to say, yes, we need a policy repo. I don't think it's a given. Okay. That's what's been explained to me, right? I could be wrong.
Yeah, I wanted to tease, I just wanted to get Brian to clarify what he meant by policy distribution, because I think there are two kinds, right? There's maybe a central place where policies get defined, and then there needs to be some way to distribute them out for, marching orders out for enforcement. But then there's also part of the VNF definition will contain policies. Those policies may not be in the format that ONAP accepts. And they may need to be transcoded into something that's
enforceable.
Yes.
That's correct. Understood. At some high level, we're going to abstract into an intent level of policy probably. But your point is exactly true. In a typical policy framework, you have an enforcement point. And the point about distribution is I'm saying we have to get policies to the enforcement point where they will be applied. Those policies could be, generic, independent of any VNFs running anywhere, or also, related to some more abstract expression of intent inside the package, and translated into a specific policy that gets enforced at a particular place in the architecture. That's what I meant by distribution.
I just carry on to that. I think I personally would argue also, how do we onboard enforcement points too? Because if somebody asks for a policy, hey, what's the policy for me to do this? How do we know they did it? How do we know that they, did what they were supposed to do in that enforcement side? And we may want to take an approach where we onboard who gets to enforce stuff and who doesn't. So that may, be security through our API and things like that.
So back to project definitions. So I see a project with 4 parts. The first part would have to do VNF definition of policies inside the VNF model. That would be the first part. The second part would be about discovery of capabilities, infrastructure capabilities. The third part would be about matchmaking of infrastructure capabilities against requirements in the VNF template. And that would be the placement, right? Or for that matter, if it's single closed loop, I'm not sure if there are multiple. It could also be used at runtime as well, right? And then there's another part, which is runtime modeling of policies, or modeling of policies in general, because once you've activated something, now you've got to continue, you're going to continue poking at it and saying, is it healthy? Is it healthy? Does it need to be moved? And then where do I find the policies again? Where are they stored?
Brian, can you?
I'm not sure I got the last one.
The last one.
Yes, I'll capture that.
The last one had to do with sort of the runtime modeling of policies versus design stuff. I guess maybe it'll go, I don't know how, I guess it would go into the repo again and get reinterpreted. Policies can be adjusted at runtime. Sure. So when that happens.
Updating of, okay.
Right, so what happens then, right? So if I change policies, does it mean that they apply to the catalog as well? And all new instantiations are going to be done based on new policies? Or is it going to be done, it's only going to apply to running instances? Right, that's the next level of worry and details.
Yeah, so today what we do is it applies to everything from that. If we want to bifurcate that and say we want a separate one, things like that.
Why do what?
What storage, what is that?
So it has to do with whether or not the system is going to eventually be multi-tenant, because the catalog could be exposed to multiple tenants. And so, but then the policies at runtime could be adjusted for each tenant indifferently. And there may be other qualifications that will determine how far, each tenant can go or what they can get.
So the way I see it is I actually think there's a need for a project that allows you to do this smart type of specification of policies based on different attributes of what you're trying to do. Tenant size, VNF size, all sorts of different attributes that you want to use.
Maybe fine grain controlling it.
So, I would settle for the basics in release 1, right?
Me too.
Yeah, that's important. Keep it simple. It's a very complex area.
Last year, that one project, I feel like, I know for sure we definitely want a project for how do we express policy, especially during design time for VNF services.
Yeah, and maybe we want to break some of the stuff out. I just what I try to do is define the loop, right?
Okay.
I added one to the list, just FYI. I captured infrastructure policies, which I take to be VNF specific or service specific policies, probably packaged, et cetera. Policy distribution, as I described it, being the mechanism for getting it out and putting to the enforcement point. The third is generic policies, in that there will be things that are not VNF specific, as I mentioned, that we want to implement in some policy framework. How do we develop those? How do we distribute, apply them, monitor them, et cetera? It's significantly different set of concerns compared to what Alex called the infrastructure policy.
Yeah. So, yeah.
Okay. We're running out of time here. I think the next.
Quickly from the use cases, right? The use cases that require policies to support things like auto scaling, auto healing, ticket generation, open loop policies, policies around configuration flow. Do we have projects to support all of
I'm not sure we do, because maybe we should have a project for that, but at least for the control loop policies, that we should probably have a project for that. Because we'll need tight integration with class and everything.
Maybe it can be class tested.
Could be. Okay.
So there's another one, by the way, related to that, which is also security related. Okay. There's resource allocation limits, or policies that would guide not just when to stop, because I can launch a denial of service attack by just allocating and expanding things. So there's got to be some quota policies.
Yeah, quota type of stuff.
And then the other one, just to see something you said, Oh, yes, business continuity, right? So,
Right, guarantee if you're taking some part of the network down, you want to make sure you have at least another part up or something.
well, no, even simpler than that.
Okay.
Since I don't have infinite numbers of resources, or at least I don't know anyone who has infinite, pockets to buy stuff. If I have a choice of giving resources to service A or service B, I may want to do it based on whether or not which one of them will cause a CNN moment if it goes out.
Yeah, I think
So, or risk management policies and other things. And that's a pretty common use case where they classify everything. I don't want to lose Facebook for more than 30 seconds, so risk.
All the policy, this policy is not agnostic to what policies are in it. It doesn't care.
Yeah, I agree with that. We have a platform and we should care what policies are in there. We should just be able to enforce them.
But I think the richness of expression is what we're talking about, right? It's not just the generic engine to define them and then to enforce them, but it's also about, what kind of weirdness you have to handle in terms of the complexity you have to handle in terms of stuff.
Policies are not in the enforcement point. It's going to have to be able to interpret whatever.
Sure, but what happens is you have to then start interacting with the appropriate enforcement points, right? So let's say that if there are policies around placement, you need to be able to talk to something that understands that. So there is the model of what is that policy trying to do and who do you interact with appropriately.
Again, it's not about this policy publishing how the policies can be fetched or the enforcement point to.
That API hey, I need a policy decision. So yeah, we probably need an API to support that, so that
Rather than the fertilizer constantly chasing your enforcement point, you can never tell what's enforcement. You know what I mean? People should be able to keep up with magical new enforcement points.
Right. That's what that's where I meant about enforcement point onboarding. I feel like that's very important that, first of all, we make sure we know who's going to be an enforcement point and that they're conforming to, that they're actually going to be enforcing the policies, as well as we don't do anything on our end to screw them up. You know what I mean? We should be giving them back, information that makes it difficult for them to go, well, I don't know what to do right now. So we need to make that very clear on how that works, those three things. So
we should also add to the project the integration testing.
yeah, I think that's a part of the project, right? I mean, how are we going to test it? How are we going to measure success? Things like that. Another session? Maybe we could just double up here. Nobody's kicking me out, so. Okay, so, Brian, thank you. Do you want to do that last save? It looks like, so everybody can take a look at it.
Yeah, on that last point with regard to testing, clearly like documentation, each of these individual projects will have, unit level, integration level, and system level test goals, I'm sure. We can bring, for example, some of the work that we've been doing with the VNF event stream project, as a way to drive closed loop policy, to the test framework as well.
Just wanted to clarify, are you talking about fault injection type testing for policies or more static?
Well, any event which results in a state change, which is monitored and causes a closed loop action for whatever purpose, can be, emulated, and so that you test the reaction of the system. What I'm saying is we can bring those testing framework approaches to the table as part of the projects.
Thank you.
Thank you, everybody.
Brian, you want to hand me the presentation rights to Steve?
Yeah, we'll do, Steve. Okay.
I would want the fault injection.
Inject conditions that was caught in the policy trigger.
Four people back. Ready to go. And I'll do the I'm already, it's already done. Share your screen here. Yes, you can share that.
I already know what the real.
Thank you very much. I have to share.
We took notes for this morning. The page and whatever. Somebody who's the mediator of this session on the certification? Who's mediating? You're mediating? Okay. Can someone help him? Okay.
I'll make sure you share.
So this is the, okay. All right. You have till, is it 3:30?
3:40.
Yeah, we have, from the agenda, we have till 3:40.
3:40. You have 3:40. Okay.
So this is the certification onboarding guidelines, process requirements, certification environment for BNF verification, import into SDC, and design and execution on ONAPF. Okay. So that's what we're here for. So we have a template that we need to try and fill out to create a project in this space. So that's the main activity for the session. I had a contribution from AT&T that is about the D2 ICE program that AT&T has been using for the last couple of years to onboard BNFs into AT&T. So that's being contributed into ONAPF. So I loaded that so you have some idea of that. So if you like, I can take let me pull it up and show you the document. I wasn't planning to read through it. Hopefully Eric Sundloff is the author. He's the AT&T representative in the foundry in California that's been working on the ICE program. Fortunately, he's tied up at some other meetings in Texas today. Hopefully he's joining us on the phone. I don't know if he's made it there yet or not. Are you there, Eric? So anyway, so this gives you a background on what onboarding means to AT&T for those that aren't familiar with it, and talks about the notion of trying to turn this into some sort of certification program for BNF. So that's where AT&T would like to go. We have some more details in here about specific objectives in terms of how to create the certification based on the BNF guidelines, and so that on that. So is uploaded and there for your reading pleasure. I don't want to take our whole 20 minutes to go through this document. So I'll let you pull it down and read it at your leisure.
I have a quick question. Yeah. Why do we need the certification? We have an open source environment. All the components are already open when vendors have access to it, right? So they can run this environment and self-certify them. Why do we need to have this funnel? Let them take the risk and everything is open. They have the infrastructure, the components that they need to run against. The requirements are written up, so they can self-certify them.
So the scope of the certification is something for the ONAP community to decide.
Yeah.
I think the objective for AT&T is that it would be nice to actually have a industry certification that DNS are compatible, conformant with ONAP, because that gives us to the point where those DNS are ready then to come into the operator lab for more functional testing.
But that means, do we really need that step? It is a cost involved when you have to go to certify election. And if we are going into open source environment and ONAP, right, where everything is contributed, then infrastructure we're using, right? The vendors who are building a functionality, right, can use the same component to see if everything is working and let them self-certify and take the risk by sharing the network if you want to come on our network.
Sure.
Two comments. So I don't really agree with certification. I think there needs to be a third-party auditing of that. But my question is, do we need certification for release 1 use case?
I don't have an answer. That's for us to decide.
On a point of law, one of the things that changed in Europe in about 1996 was it went to the point where if you were the senior engineer of a telecommunications product, you could certify you met all the appropriate regulatory requirements because I had to sign those documents. You are clearly putting you and your company's reputation on the line to back it up, but there's no reason why a serious company would not want to do that. Just to go to add requirements that are not necessary.
And to your point, so seriousness comes in is what speed is your vendor taking with you as a service provider. To be honest about it, right? If they want to stay in my service provider network, and I make sure that they are serious about it by taking some liability on them, right? Then that self-certification would probably work.
A lot of the certification is for interoperability. That's why it was created. My company, cable background, cable lines, and there's tons of certification on adoption protocol.
All the homologation requirements waiting for
So is there any good use cases for additional certification of work for providers?
Yeah. Actually, I was involved at one time. I was part of the and we were required at that point to self-certify. And they said, hey guys, if you want to come into our network and you want to test things, you pay for the test use of the resources in the lab. Yeah. In ONAP, we have open infrastructure, open source, and everything available, right? You can go and test it. It's a functionality that if I want to be sure to do end-to-end follow through, right? That's a different story. But whatever you work for it. Absolutely. No, but then your lab also. You took the liability part of the contract saying, hey guys, if you fail for certain things and it didn't perform the way it's supposed to perform, then you have taken over the liability also.
So maybe it's the operator side of it.
Exactly. So that's a different paradigm to think about, at least. And I'm saying our goal should be to reduce costs in the overall network somehow. And there's so many levels of testing we do and certification we do. We need to reduce it.
You have to do that with every one of the tier 1 operators. That's 16 sets of tests that they need to go through. And actually, 99% of them will be the same. So what are we doing?
So out of that, I expected that there is some sort of need around the certification. We have some questions about who certifies it, exactly what it is that gets certified.
Any comments on this? So just as an operator, just make sure that, because we go through this every day now. there are multiple levels of certification here. This is not like one certification. Certification simply helps us to de-risk production of our services. A vendor comes in and says, I have met what you guys asked me to do. And then we put them in a production cycle, and then we find out 2 months later, they're missing a certain API, they're missing a certain telemetry. It stops everything. Doesn't matter who's at fault, it stops everything. And it really pushes, it doesn't matter if it's the vendor's problem. It means nothing. We've already missed the delivery. There are 2 levels of testing in here. There is the testing and certification of saying, which I think some people argue this morning, is the validation. Let's not argue about validation versus certification. There is a level of testing required to say that you're giving me a heat template, or Tosca model, or a microservice, or whatever the case may be. ONAP as a community created guidelines, which we're going to drive those as requirements. Okay? And so there's a level of testing that says ONAP will work together to create those guidelines and drive into requirements. We may provide an environment to allow anyone, okay, to test in that environment. Okay? This is not, doesn't mean that I'm going to take that model and then I'm going to put it in my network. As an operator, you still have to do a second level of certification where you now take whatever that model is, that VNF is, and you have to do your backend integration on the OSS and DSS and everything else, and your policies. That's an operator specific. The operator specific part, every operator still has to do. And ONAP will not be responsible for that. But what ONAP is trying to do is to create a community-wide plan, guidelines, requirement, and say that this is what we need to drive in terms of checking and evaluating those models. So as an operator, we will not even talk to any DNF vendor unless you come in and says, I have followed the ONAP certification and I certify it. Whether they certify it in the ONAP environment or not, but we know that the community has defined the guidelines and the requirements, and they have certified it before we'll even consider talking to them about it. Okay? And we can actually have us, if AT&T wants to go and certify it on that, just evaluate it on that environment, and we would do that if we want to basically do that. But the idea is that to de-risk the project, de-risk the deployment, so that you don't take somebody's word, and then you are halfway through deployment and you find out the model is broken, the API is broken, the telemetry is not exactly what it could be, and it could be just one letter change. Okay, this is why I think it's important for the. Now, ONAP is not responsible in stamping to say that your VNF is certified operators can use. No, ONAP is defining the guidelines and the certification, the requirement to say that this is how things should be certified. Now, we will probably provide an environment to allow anybody to validate your VNF on that guideline. That's a budget issue that we have to worry about.
So, Bhasin, if I'm understanding correct, so what I'm hearing from you, at a ONAP level, a single vendor, single VNF can be certified based on the guidelines that are published. And then when you come to a service provider, you're looking at end-to-end and trying to look at interoperability between different vendors to look at a service, end-to-end service scenarios, and that certification really lies as a responsibility.
That's correct. So today in the D2Is, I think, which Steve was talking about, we will not even consider putting any VNF or commit to a VNF in any release unless we have actually seen the output of the validation certification environment from the D2Is, and we are absolutely sure it met all the requirements. When we see that log and we know it's passed, then we will consider using it or planning it for production.
So I think then one of the...
And it's a self-service. It has to be self-service. Because if there are 100 vendors who want to do that, you cannot be in that process. So ONAP is not going to be a bottleneck to say that unless the TSC certify you, you cannot talk. ONAP is not in that business.
So we need to at least spell out what are those requirements that vendors need to meet as part of onboarding certification.
So you need to have a project that says ONAP will have to define what is a requirement and what's a guideline, because those are completely two different things. The requirement means nothing will be considered validated unless you've met. Guidelines is some VNF vendors may decide to follow and some of them not. That has to be sort of a process. Again, I'm just giving you an experience from one operator. It doesn't mean that's how ONAP should do it, but just want to make sure that moves through discussion.
So as an operator that has all those ONAP requirements as a data provider, or you can put it in production, or you can do some level of certification testing on your own, right?
So what I was saying is that we're not repeating the ONAP certificate. Our certification as an operator is a different level of certification.
That's what I did.
Yeah, it's like, you know, imagine is that you've certified a container that does some sort of a microservice, some analytics. As long as I know what the criteria was for certification we would do is putting it in a service, doing an end-to-end type of testing and certification. It's not going to be sort of a VNF or a microservice certification. Does that make sense?
Can I remind people to speak up because the conference call folks can hear you?
Can I make some comments? So what I hear is the certification program is trying for operators to reduce risk. But I'm wondering, can we achieve that goal or not? Because, you know, if we, like you just mentioned, we have a certification program, we require the buyer or the provider that provide the things for you for testing and then. So if that means they cannot change the bug, they cannot make after they get a certification. If they do a minor change, they have to do re-certification. And also, if that's allowed, even that isn't allowed, there's many ways they can break it. When you do the end-to-end testing, people can never find it out. There's real risk. They can hide it out the risk very easily. So that's one point. So can we achieve the goal of the reduced risk? The second point is so that's I worry most. Because anywhere if we provide some kind of certification program, it slows things down. So for the developer, for the for the service provider, I mean for the VNF provider, so a lot of the companies right now they're using agile development. Their code is constantly changing. Their features, their design is constantly changing. So that seems like it all looks like a breakout out after you slow down their process. That's the second point I want to make. And the third point I want to make, if you look at the history of the certification program, most of them never successful. Even we look at the Windows program. Windows program, they used to have the Windows certification from Microsoft. Even that program is not successful at all. So I used to work on that project. But no, that's most successful Windows programs, they can never get that certification from Microsoft. So
sorry to interrupt, but there is someone on the phone. He cannot hear anyone.
Where is the microphone? Okay, so I can only speak based on facts of what we have done for the past 2 years. I can't speak on Microsoft or anybody else because every problem is different and every project is different. Okay, so number one, it's helped us to de-risk our deployment significantly. I'll just tell you that right now. Okay. Number two, it does work, and it doesn't impact your deployment cycle because validation that we do through like a program like this happens completely in parallel. Okay, we have releases every 4 or 5 months. Okay, VNF validation. Like I said, we're not doing the end-to-end validation certification. We're doing basically the model validation. That happens around the clock. A vendor can come into this environment and test independent of any release cycle. We can have 100 vendors today coming in to test VNF they are doing research on for potential next year or the year after deployment. It's completely independent of production. When we go through our life cycle of production, there's nothing in here that says
we have to spend the first 3 weeks doing a VNF certification. The assumption that we would have never started if the VNFs have not been certified already. You know what I'm saying? The two are completely basically independent of the project release versus the VNF certification. Again, I'm only talking about from one operator view. I can't speak about everything else. It has taken us 2.5 years to make this happen. And the challenge that we spend every day on, that the team spend a lot of, is that how do you make it self-serve so that a VNF vendor can come in and just do this practically on their own and shrink down the process so that they can do this in a day or two. They can get all the information they need of what changes they have to do. So it's not just you passed or you didn't. You also why you didn't pass, what changes are required. You have to have all that information to come and certify again. Now, if you have to redo the validation 3-4 times, it's not a big deal if it's very quick. And that's sort of what we're trying to do, is just bring down that process to make it as much self-service and quick as possible. From an ONAP, the challenge is going to be is that as we change the guidelines and requirements, we've got to make sure that the certification just follows. It's a closed loop. It can't be an open loop. Sorry, I spoke too much. I'll shut up there.
Igor, Ziggy, and then.
Guys, speak to the mic because they're. Yeah, I came here on purpose to speak to the mic. I basically fully agree with the I'm graphene cable labs. One question, whether it was considered in this group, what is needed to ensure that we even can get to certification and testing with the proper code. And that is the matter of package signing and validation of the package signing, which actually would require certain hardware and key management scheme and so on. We've been actually thinking a lot about it and have provided some specification, and NSVSec has been identified as this important matter. And I would be happy to share those and contribute. But my question is whether that has been considered. How do we know, for example, for sure, that the code that we see has not been modified after it was delivered from the vendor or in the process of being delivered?
Okay, so I've captured package signing and attestation segment, and then
that package signing needs to be part of the SDK.
It's written on the board now. The question I was going to raise is, listening to the discussion, there are lots of different understandings of what we mean by certification. And I think probably the first thing we need to do is to write down, this is what we mean, what is in scope and what is out of scope. Because otherwise we'll end up having sort of discussions at cross purposes.
How about one out of scope aspect? We are not certifying a VNF per standards compliance for the function that VNF is supposed to be providing. And in contrast, we are specifically focusing upon the compatibility of that VNF with the design tools that enable the ONAP platform to lifecycle manage it. Sorry, this is Brian from AT&T, if you didn't know.
So I've got two bullets about VNF guidelines compliance and operation with ONAP.
What I was saying was that I think that just to condense that, it's you're really doing interoperability certification, and that's about.
But it's with a tool, not interoperability of the VNF with another VNF. It's purely with the ONAP tool set.
Yeah. I just want to get to the point. You said you may slow down the process. You may slow down the process if you want to. But I disagree with that. If you want the VNF guideline, we can automate as much as possible. Every time you make a code modification, if it has an impact on your modeling, artifact, and so on, you can retest it automatically. So I just want to point out that we need to produce VNF guidelines
where we can produce some tests on it. If I produce a guideline that I can't check automatically, it's not relevant for it. So we need also to be sure that the guideline can be certified and checked by a test. Otherwise, it's only subjective. So we need to have this formal verification.
Yeah, I agree with those on this one. If we could have some kind of automated test kit ready, for example, we could even create national data that create some kind of dummy winners by follow that kind of guideline. So we create some kind of test kit on that. Then there's a mechanism automatically trigger those kind of tests. So that will make the whole thing faster. This is really a tool to provide that kind of capability.
Let me just make it work because so all this automatic testing covers certain scenarios. You cannot cover the real risk, the people trying to get in if they really want to.
That's not this project problem, right? For example, this one provides those kind of tools. Some kind of like the telcos, they want to deploy this one in their environment. Leverage one as their production or whatever certificate marketplace for that. Then we could do that. We could also provide some kind of kit to say if it is a security issue and something as a community. But it is really not this. This project will have some kind of authority to do something like that. Earlier, like nothing said in one sentence.
Okay, it's a good discussion. I've tried to capture the points on the screen there. Sorry, Eric?
Yeah, so I was wondering, where does the infra requirement belong? Because I think that we do need the DNF to actually specify that, and that could be on many different domains. It could be I need a specific ONAPF service. It could be I need a specific resource from the infrastructure. I qualify for the following security grading. I'm interoperable with XYZ for creation of the service. There is work obviously going on multiple of these things in whatever industry consortium standard organizations, but I think from ONA's point of view, that would be part of the guideline, and then when we look inward into ONA, we could derive potentially multiple efficiencies from having that kind of a metadata. And the beauty of the word metadata is that going back to the comments made by I think that gentleman over there, is that we have proof that it doesn't actually slow down the development cycle. Because we're not asking people to change their application. We are only saying, hey, could you please annotate this as a metadata? And we do many things with that annotation, and all we need you to do is give it to us in a way we could automatically parse it, process it, and make some decisions based on that.
Okay. Back to the point about both changes to the metadata is also the operations of DNS on a particular infrastructure resource. Could be considered. Yes.
Yeah, I was just wondering, what would be the notification process if when we have been notified from DNS, which is consumed by ICO? What would be the notification process if the problem we have is not related to ICO, to ONAPF itself, but it's related to the DNS? Will we notify, because if we are stuck.
So are you talking about something going through the certification process, or something that's already been certified and it's in operation and it's now got a problem?
So when we do end-to-end testing for ONAPF, we need to notify a set of DNS which will be connected with ONAPF, right? Or that will be consumed onboarding by ONAPF. During the testing, we identify that we have an issue, but it's not related to the code generated for ONAPF. It's related to the code within the DNS. So that's why I was wondering what will be the notification process or the mechanism to notify the vendor, supplier, or if it is a VNF developed by yourself?
I think there was like 3 separate things going on here. So the certification activities are just on the DNS, and that's sort of asynchronous to everything else. It just goes to does it work with some standard config of ONAP.
Can you speak to the mic, please?
Yeah. So I think that one.
This VNF, we just say, okay, it does not work with ONAP, we descope for. Yeah, I know. So ideally, all of our, so there is I think a notion of a reference VNF that we would want to use both for testing the main platform and also for testing the validation scheme and everything else. So you'd want those reference VNFs to all pass the certification scheme to be good examples. If there's a problem with the in the end-to-end test, if you find a problem with the testing that was done in certification, then you go back to the certification. If it's a problem with that reference VNF that's independent, then you've got to go back to who's the owner of that reference VNF. But that's a notification coming out of the end-to-end testing regime, which is kind of separate to the certification. Yeah, I think you don't understand my question. So I fully understand you have the VNF certification. If it is not okay, we don't consider it. But sometimes you need to test your own app with something real. So a real VNF. And my concern is, even if the VNF has passed all the certification, whatever the VNF guidelines, tick in the box. Now we are in the real life, and we are using ONAP in an environment. But unfortunately, the VNF is not working with ONAP. That's my concern. What is the mechanism of notification for these VNF vendors, whatever, say, hey guys, we have tried your VNF, but unfortunately it does not work with ONAP. Is it planned, or do we just say we scope this VNF for? And also, what about the selection? Because we have to test ONAP with something. Do you understand my question now?
Catherine, it's a good question. And I think the session before this, I think you were advocating, I think you may have been at the session, where she was advocating that even if we do all these, pieces like certification, test, we still need an end-to-end sort of testing to make sure that that was the proposal she was driving. It's outside. This is only one piece of what she was proposing. But I agree with you. Someone has to. There was a debate whether that project was too big. The whole idea was these projects will still continue as micro projects that have to happen, but there needs to be someone or a group that looks at the end-to-end, because we may find out, like you said, that VNF is certified based on guidelines and requirements, but it just doesn't work. It's exactly what she was advocating.
I'm sure you raised it.
That's what she was.
I think some of that's out of the scope of the certification, but there is certainly the point of there's going to be some evolution of the certification criteria based on experience as we go forward. So that's certainly we need to be able to capture that.
Yes, Steve, can you hear me?
Yep.
Yeah, so I want to make a comment. Background noise here, that's why I'm mute most of the time. I think what we need to keep in mind first here is that we can scope the certification that is really, really big. I think it's more important for us to start the journey as far as defining what our first step is. Starting with onboarding and getting ironed out what it means to define guidelines that we all agree as a community is the baseline of a VNF, and getting that ironed out and getting that as far as the stamp in ONAP, what an ONAP compatible stamp would be like. I think that's better than getting stuck in trying to solve all possible aspects of what a certification could look like in an ideal world. I think we can all agree that we kind of have to start it somewhere. Starting it with just validating towards onboarding and instantiation means that we have a well-defined scope. It is within the realm of what we understand. at AT&T had some experience as far as what we have done before. It's our experience. I think there's a lot of other efforts such as the VNF SDK that can really contribute in as far as the aspects for the OpenO side and how that would look like. But I think there's a danger to get stuck in every possible aspect of certification and trying to solve that before we start doing the first steps. Make sense?
Yep, thanks, Eric. So that actually brings me back to an earlier point.
Hey, Stephen?
Yeah.
Just FYI, in the chat on the previous point about how do we know when a VNF is misbehaving, right? You know, after we've already certified it, et cetera, I put something in the chat which would be a path toward having a capability for that. I can put that on the wiki if you'd like.
Yeah, why don't you put that as a comment below this document in the wiki? That's probably the best way.
Will do.
Thanks, Brian. So I think there was a comment earlier about whether this applied to release 1, and I wanted to just follow up on that point because that seems to tie into just get started, but also how does it relate to releases? And I wondered whether that was really a question of whether we needed to wait until release 1 was complete to do this, or whether you were wondering whether there's so much work here we'll never get it done for release 1, or quite what was the so both.
Yeah, I mean, if it's relevant for use case 1, maybe then we just do a small skeleton conformance type thing.
So we may have a so I want to be careful not to prejudge things until we get scope of the project and the resources nailed down. But I think that the possibility is there that we may have some smaller set of certification features at release 1, and then some bigger sets coming in release 2. And the scope of the validation.
And maybe it's not our responsibility to prioritize projects here. Oh, let's define the project and then TSC prioritize.
Yeah. Okay.
I have a question about it because if we produce a new VNF, how can we certify VNF integration, third-party VNF manager, and so on? How do we manage that? If we have several paths.
So so in the testing regime, you're going to have a definite set of tests that you operate against. So there is a decision that the community has to make there about what those set of tests are. And I think it's not just the set of tests. It actually comes down to what the ONAP configuration that you're testing the VNF against. So you can package ONAP in different number of virtual machines, for instance, right? So it's you're going to have to pick a standard thing to test the VNFs against.
Also, what NFVI context, Stephen?
Sorry?
Also, what NFVI context you're testing it in? Is it a public cloud, private cloud, et cetera?
Probably yes. Certainly the resource scope needs to be different.
That's also something we probably didn't get a deep dive into that piece for the integration session we discussed. We are trying to create a couple of either you call it a community integration app or some kind of open app, which will implement whatever the board approved the use case in that lab. So with the OLAP and also user tools OLAP could provide to onboarding the vendors, volunteers who want to provide, and to do that, and then get deployed end-to-end in a real environment. So that is what we practiced in OpenO. We built 2 community labs. One is the China Mobile, one is the telecom. So in the OLAP, we hope we could build a few of that, then use OLAP to do that kind of orchestration across the whole multiple telcos map. I want to call it a kind of reference telco integrated cloud.
So what is different? I'm sorry, I didn't get it. What is different between the different telcos in this context? Why do you need those separate environments for each telco?
Because the different telcos, they might, we just wanted to, for example, we want to test the OLAP with scale. So that's why, for example, like today, at China Telecom, they have 3 use cases implementing in their lab. They have the virtual CPE for residential, virtual CPE for enterprise, and they have VoLTE. So it works, which is orchestrated by OpenO, and also China Telecom. They have a use case called extended for the virtual CPE. Yeah, that kind of use case. So they're slightly different. So we wanted to simulate without those kind of IT for the open source community to test the open source OLAP in real environment and also with multi vendors, real sense. That's the whole goal. And also like the WinF, if they want to test, which is really volunteer. We don't have any authority to do those things. We just kind of facilitate the whole process.
But if we drive things towards, I'm going to use the loose word, standardization of the VNF, okay? Imagine if we drive it towards, so that a VNF that China Mobile is using and a VNF that Orange is using, they may do different functions, but they have the same protocol, same API, same standardization. The use case is different because the function of the VNF is different.
Right.
Would we still need to have a lab for every operator?
You don't need to have a lab for every operator. In that one, we just want to provide someone something in the real environment with scale. And also the ultimate goal for that one, testing is one sense. Another one is help the industry adaptation. For example, if AT&T build such a lab, so anyone who wants to try the features, want to look at those things, they could go. That's why they call it open app. So they could go to the portal to test some kind of things, but that map will be maintained by the integration team, including how to help you to deploy the new release of OLAP or some other things as well. So that's just kind of some kind of thought, nothing finalized.
No, I got it.
Right.
I had a couple of inputs on the certification process. So usually there are 2 things where we have to ensure that interoperability is maintained. One that you have put up here, certification of the VNF with respect to ONAPF. The second part is the underlying cloud platform interfaces also need to work, because in many service providers, they are using the different flavors of OpenStack. And, you know, it is important that ONAPF not only supports, the VNF not only supports ONAPF, but ONAPF also supports the underlying cloud platform. So we can have 2 technology compatibility kits for test suits, one for the VNF certification, the other one for the interop between ONAPF and the underlying cloud platform. And the third thing which I would like to suggest is that most of the VNF providers are also coming up with their own VNF manager. So VNF manager interfacing with ONAPF, with AppC/VFC, that is the third area that we should cover, so that we are safe. And the environment in which this testing should happen, there are 2 alternatives. One is, of course, we can have a neutral environment like a public cloud, where everyone can, where we have a running reference implementation of ONAPF, which would be a pre-release one even. So we don't need to wait till release 1 in order for VNF vendors to start, using the platform. The other way is that other operators, they can come up with reference labs where the release would be available and certification can happen. That's my 2 cents.
Yeah, I would like to extend on this. This session talks about the VNF certification, but it's indeed the whole lower layer of the platform part. And it is very important. This is also where things can break, where the VNF can be certified, but when it comes to run on the entire complete use case end-to-end, including the platform, things are not going to work properly.
So I think you guys should write it down, okay? There are efforts, I think next week at OpenStack, to try to figure out whether one could start projects through OpenStack, so that OpenStack releases can verify with ONAP, test with ONAP before formal release is done. So these are all initial discussions, but I think it's an important one. There is a stack of testing we need to do. So before you get to the end-to-end service testing, there's still stacks you need to test ONAP with, I don't know, with OpenStack release or whatever the case may be. Those things, I agree with that. You should write it down.
Cloud infrastructure, the VNF and VNF. We should work maybe with ONAP because ONAP will be much more focused on ONAP and the code. Because to be honest, OpenStack, they don't care about ONAP.
No, but they don't care today. Not when we're done. When we're done, that will change. I want to make sure that you understand.
Why OpenAV, I think OpenAV, we are working on the certification process of an hyper. So maybe I think we should merge with OpenAV certification process.
Agree. So the OpenNFV folks, I have a bunch of folks from AT&T on OpenNFV, Doug and people like that. They're aware of it. In fact, that is the ask. I've asked, that should be a clear project. From an ONAP, we should write it down. It has to be done. Okay? Yeah. Whether we do it, OpenNFV do it, or OpenStack, somebody has to do it because otherwise we're stuck. Based on what these guys are saying, we're stuck.
Yeah, and I think OpenAV is a great start, but you probably don't want to limit yourself only to one type of, flavor. Okay, and there is also not just OpenStack. There is other clouds that ONAP would like to support.
Yeah.
Okay, right.
Yeah. Agree with that.
Actually,
So
for the community's information, I want to add one thing is for the OpenAV, before we had a project in OpenAV to do that kind of test called Opera, which do the kind of test with different OpenStack version or upstream, downstream, basically into the OpenAV with the whole process. In fact, past yesterday, which is their e-release deadline to submit, we'll have quite some kind of debate. They say if ONAP wants to inherit that project, we say we don't know. We need to depend on the ONAP TSA to decide.
Yeah, Helen, so next week we'll have discussions at OpenStack on that specific point. And also we can have discussions on what OPNFV can bring to ONAP as far as enabling integration, also, dynamic cross-community CI, integration with different cloud distributions, et cetera, as OPNFV works on, including hybrid clouds such as OpenO had worked on previously.
So give us a few, 1 week is a grace period, because I know you guys deadline is yesterday, but we haven't figured out how to do it yet.
Okay. So we are, I think, 5 minutes over time, but try to capture the comments as people have been discussing them. I think we're talking about one project here for this rather than more than one project. Or at least I propose we start with one project and then see how it goes. I think there's whatever project team gets assigned this, they'll have a bunch of work to do to come back with a more coherent proposal for the community and for the board eventually to approve. So any last comments, anything missing? Anyone have any heartburn with anything on the screen? If not, then I think we can adjourn and head to the next section. Thank you all.
Thank you.
It is a great right now, it's 4 o'clock, and we are meeting in the auditorium back